Sometimes you just need that piece in your wardrobe that's not as thick and heavy as a full-on jacket or coat, but a little bit more substantial than your basic regular shirt. And that's where a shacket comes into play. Such a fun play on words too. And in this episode of the Quilted Runway, we are going to be stitching up our new Saguaro Shacket pattern. And I'm going to be piecing together a brand new quilt top in flannel fabrics to make it nice and cozy and kind of that classic look. So let's jump in and get started. Here are all the materials. First, we have the paper pattern pieces, printed and tiled together. For the fabric, I'm using 2 fat quarter bundles from the Maywood Studio Woolies Flannel collection for the quilt and approximately 5 yards of plaid white tan fabric from the same collection for the quilt background and shacket lining. The exact fabric amount will be according to your quilt top instructions. I'm making the Radiant Beauty quilt from the Fawns and Porter's Quick and Easy Quilts Fall 2025 issue. It has a finished size of 60 by 60 inches, which fits these shacket pattern pieces perfectly. For the thread, I got a matching color to my background lining fabric. If you want to serge some of your seams, also pick up some matching serger cone threads. For the closure, I'm using snaps, but you could also use buttons. You'll need 9 in total. And I just love this snap kit I got from Amazon with all these colors I can match to my fabric. You may also want to use a point turner in this project. I used mine a lot, especially for the collar. Speaking of the collar, have a small bit of fusible woven light to medium weight interfacing for those pieces. When sewing with flannel, I like to use a size 90 sewing machine needle. Also have on hand all your other basic sewing essentials like scissors, pins, and fabric marking tools. The first step is to assemble the quilt top. I'm prepping my fabric for cutting, which means pressing out the fold lines. I always like to print out my quilt instructions so I can make notes on fabric color changes from the original design and also mark off which ones I have already cut. To cut the pieces, I first like to take my ruler, and I just love my SewTites ruler for this part with magnets, and trim the bottom edge to make it square. Then I follow the instructions to cut each fabric's dimensions. The quilt top I'm making has a lot of squares, so I cut a bunch of rows and then the squares from those. After I'm finished cutting a fabric, I like to use a little sticky note and write the piece name and size. Keep cutting until you have all the pieces for your quilt top. I started with making all the units based off of my instructions. This quilt has a lot of pieced triangle squares, which are so fun to make. First, place the required squares right sides together and draw 3 lines. First being from corner to corner, and the others 1/4 inch away from each side of the center line. I like to batch sew, so I marked and took the entire stack to my machine and stitched down each outer line, leaving that center corner to corner line unsewn. Once stitched, I used a rotary cutter to cut down the center line of each piece. Then I pressed the allowances open of each unit. After pressing, I also like to trim the corners of my units to make them nice and neat. Once all the units are done, I label them with the unit number and how many there are, then which diagram they are used in, and repeat for all units. With all my units made, I can start arranging the sections of the quilt top. I love this step since I can start to visualize the quilt. I start by laying everything out. I first stitch the row units together, then those rows together, and the allowances of the rows open. This quilt has these flying geese sections that I love, and I started to arrange and stitch them together next. Once all my sections were sewn, I referred to the diagram in my instructions and arranged my entire quilt top. Then I stitched it all together, pressing as I went. I'm just so thrilled with how my quilt top turned out. It was so quick and easy to actually put together because of the large blocks. And I love how the colors of the flannel really pop against the background. I think I need to make another one to remain as a quilt, but I can't wait to cut out this one and wear it anywhere I go, and it will keep me cozy. And I left this as just the quilt top, so it's not backed before you cut out the shacket pattern pieces. And speaking of the pattern pieces, I have them cut out along my size line. And to determine my size, I used my bust circumference measurement and compared it to the size chart. So I actually need to lay this out on the ground. My cutting table isn't big enough, and I printed 2 fronts and 2 sleeves so I can have every pattern piece laid out so I can get an idea of how it's going to look before I cut it out. So let's get this quilt cut out. Oh, I'm so excited. I played around a lot with the layout and decided this one was best. Then I started pinning all my pieces to the quilt top. For the front and hem edges, I utilized the already straight edge of the quilt top. Using a sharp pair of scissors, I got to cutting. I cut my 2 fronts and back and ended up bringing my sleeves to the cutting table, since cutting all of these on the ground at 7 months pregnant was just not ideal. The sleeve pieces fit perfectly on my cutting mat, and with SewTites, I can use magnets to more securely hold my paper pattern piece down. After cutting, I clipped into all my notches. Once my quilt top patterns were cut, I moved along to my backing and lining pieces. You'll need 2 fronts, 2 sleeves, and 1 back. For the other pattern pieces, I used leftover fat quarters in different colors for these accent pieces. You'll need 2 collars cut on the fold, 2 sleeve vent strips, as well as 2 cuffs. The cuffs need to be interfaced, and I like to use the cut out pattern pieces as my guide and lay them wrong sides down on the glue side of the interfacing. The under collar also needs to be interfaced. Once cut, fuse the interfacing to the wrong side of the pieces. If you want pockets, you can cut them now or always add them later like I did. Now we can start sewing the shacket together. First, stitch the shoulder seams of the lining piece right sides together and press seam allowances open and set aside. I grabbed my outer jacket back and fronts and stitched those shoulder seams right sides together at 5/8 of an inch and pressed the allowances open. If you want batting on the body of your jacket, you can baste it now while the fabric is lying flat. I love to use this batting, and an adhesive basting would work well here. I'm not adding any batting to mine since the 2 layers of Woolies flannel fabric is thick enough. Next step is to attach the collar. Make sure your notches are clipped in the front pieces. I grabbed my uninterfaced top collar piece and marked the seam line 5/8 of an inch away from the angled edges. Then I matched the bottom outward curved edge of the collar with the body notches at the collar seam line. I continued to pin the collar around the jacket neckline, also matching up the center backs until I reached my other front notch. I'm going to stitch the collar to my jacket from notch to notch. Repeat for the lining neckline and interfaced under collar. Sew these seams at 5/8 of an inch, following the curve of the collar. Then once stitched, I like to clip and press my seam. Using sharp scissors, I clipped into the allowances, making sure not to catch my stitching. Now I'm going to press the allowances open, and I find a pressing roll can help with this step and the shaping. Repeat sewing and pressing for the lining collar. To sew the collars together, I first laid my pieces right sides together, matching up the outer collar edges. I started pinning them right at the notch seam line, pushing the seam allowance down to expose the neckline seam stitching. Continue pinning around the collar until reaching the other front. I'm going to head to the machine and stitch around the collar edge from neckline to neckline notch. When starting the seam, you really want to make sure the allowances are pushed away from the collar on both sides. Also, pivot at the collar points. Make sure to backstitch well at the start and stop of the seam. After the collars are sewn, the next step is to actually stitch all of the side seams before we finish the front edge to the collar and hem. I pinned each of my side seams right sides together for my outer shacket and lining, and stitched at 5/8 of an inch. After sewing, I like to press my seam allowances open so the layers lay flat together. Repeat for the other side seams. With the side seams sewn, we can now finish the front and hem edges. This process gives the shacket a nice clean finish from the right and the wrong side. To start, I pushed my neckline seam allowances away from the body to reveal the seam line, and that's where we are going to start stitching. I pinned starting at this point and worked my way down the front and across the hem. Make sure the side seams match up at the hem and pin the lower edges together. To turn the shacket right side out, I'm going to leave an opening in the center back hemline approximately 4 to 6 inches wide, or wherever it makes sense to on your quilt top. I mark this opening with perpendicular pins to the seam so I know to skip sewing over that section. Continue to pin across the rest of the hem and up the other front edge. Starting at my one neckline notch seam line, I stitch and pivot to the front edge, down the front, across the hem, remembering the opening, and then back up the other side. Now I'm going to do all my clipping, trimming, and grading for the seam allowances around the collar and the shacket edges. I cut across all the corners and trimmed down the allowances to about 1/4 of an inch. Once all graded, I flipped the shacket through the opening. Through the opening, I also like to use my point turner to perfect the collar and hem points. Then I do a lot of pressing. Just look at how this collar is taking shape. For the back hem opening, press the seam allowance to the wrong side of the shacket and match the bottom folds. After much more pressing and a lot of steam, things are looking so good. I also use some quilting pins to keep the layers together to prepare for quilting. This is the point of the shacket process that you're gonna actually spend some time at the machine quilting the layers together. So with my quilting pins in place or your preferred basting method, you can do whatever quilting aesthetic that you want, free motion, straight lines, wavy stitches. I am gonna stitch in the ditch. I don't want any visible quilting lines on this particular shacket. So once I do that, I am going to finish my top stitching. So this top stitching actually closes that opening in the hem. So here's my open hem. So I'm going to start at the back because the lower back, you know, it's not the most visible part of the garment. So we're gonna start our top stitching there, and we're gonna go all around our hem, up our front, collar, we're gonna pivot, we're gonna go around the top edge of the collar, pivot down, and then back to where we started. So at that point, you can just baste your armholes together and your body of your shacket will be done, and we'll move on to the sleeves. Now I've completed one of the sleeves, just as like a little sneak peek for you. And I've already just stitched in the ditch the layers together. So it is backed, then installed the slit and the cuff. But we'll do that after I just put on an audiobook or podcast and finish all my quilting. I have already prepped my sleeve by placing the layers wrong sides together and stitching in the ditch. I also serge finished the side sleeve seam edges. Have your sleeve paper pattern piece ready to mark the vent slit and pleat. I just use some scissors and clip into the pleat notches, as well as cut up into the sleeve piece along the line to the T. Before attaching the strip, press the piece in half wrong sides together and then press in each long edge to that center fold. Open the slit and sandwich the sleeve edge in between the strip folds, leaving some excess at the start and end. And pin. For the pleat, I just fold one notch to the other, following the directional arrow on the pattern, which is towards the slit vent. I'm also going to prep my cuff. I first pressed it in half, wrong sides together, and then pressed in one long edge 5/8 of an inch towards the wrong side. To stitch the ends closed, fold right sides together along that center fold while keeping the 5/8 of an inch edge pressed under and pin. Repeat for the other side. Sew the cuff ends at 5/8 of an inch. Starting on the extending strip, stitch the strip to the sleeve opening close to the outer edge. I take this step very slow and readjust often to make sure I'm catching the sleeve opening in between the strip. At the top point, I also pivot my sewing machine needle. To define the top of the slit vent opening, fold the opening matching up the hem edges and stitch a small seam extending from the seam line to the edge of the strip, creating a tiny triangle wedge. I just love the V shape this creates. Now just to base the pleat in place. While I'm at the sewing machine, I'm also going to stitch my sleeve seam closed. Simply fold the sleeve right sides together, matching up the sleeve edges, and stitch at 5/8 of an inch from the underarm point down to the hem. At the ironing board, first trim the cuff seam allowances and turn to the right side. I like to use a point turner to perfect the lower corners and give it a nice press. For the sleeve, press the seam allowances open. I like to use a sleeve roll inside the sleeve to make this easier. Now we're going to attach the cuff to the sleeve hem. With the right sides together, exactly match up the folds at the slit vent opening and pin around the hem until you reach the other opening. Make sure to only pin the unpressed edge of the cuff. Sew together starting right at that double fold and stitch around at 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. I pushed my seam allowance down towards the cuff and wrapped the pressed edge over the allowance to meet the seam line and cover the allowances. It can also help to press the seam allowance down as you pin. Now I'm going to top stitch around the entire cuff. I like to work from the right side when top stitching, but I always make sure to check that I'm catching that cuff edge underneath. Now that our sleeve is complete with the cuff, it's time to set it in. This is the method I use for setting in all my sleeves. Keep the sleeve right side out and grab the body. Lay it right side up on your table, exposing the armhole edge. First, match up the sleeve seam at the underarm point of the shacket side seam and pin. Then grab the top notch of the sleeve and the shoulder seam of the shacket and fold it over so those points match right sides together and pin. I then just work my way around the sleeve armhole, pinning often. Starting at the underarm point, stitch around the armhole. I like to sew this seam with the sleeve piece on the top layer facing me, and I'm using a 5/8 of an inch allowance. Take your time over the sleeve crown, working the curves together. To finish this seam, I like to serge the allowances together. At this point, the shacket is basically done, excluding the closure and extra pocket details. I did try on the shacket to pin mark the overlap for my fronts. The overlap distance can vary based on desired closure and fit. Mine was about 2.5 inches. I also pinned marked a good location for a cargo pocket, which are my favorite style of pockets. The pieces are included in the pattern if you want to add one, and they are so simple to sew. First, cut them out in scrap quilt fabric and clip into all the pleat and fold lines. Fold the pocket piece wrong sides together and stitch up both pleat lines to the top of the T. Once sewn, fold the dotted line markings to create that iconic box pleat shape. Then finish around the edges and press towards the wrong side. For the flap, just fold and stitch right sides together and then flip to the right side and top stitch. I'm just going to sew on my cargo pocket before I install my snaps. The exact pocket location can again vary based on personal preference. This is why I like to wait until the jacket is finished to try it on. Mine is about 1/3 up the armhole and centered within the front panel. Pin to the jacket. For the flap, lay the unfinished edge 1/4 of an inch up from the top edge of the cargo pocket and pin. I first top stitched around the cargo pocket, pivoting at the corners. Then I moved on to the flap, where I stitched 1/2 of an inch up from the edge, trimmed back that allowance, flipped it down over the seam, and top stitched. I marked all my snap locations using an expanding sewing gauge and a heat remover fabric pen. I just love these tools. And I centered them within my overlap. I decided to go with the blue snaps, and now I'm going to install them. For one snap, there are 4 pieces, 2 for each layer that snap into one another, but refer to your specific snap instructions. I always install the top layer snaps using the tools provided in my kit. I use an awl tool to create the small hole and then the pliers. I'm installing 6 snaps down the center front, then 1 for the cargo pocket and 1 to close up each sleeve cuff. Here are all my snaps. Now, if you want to add a patch pocket, here's how you do it. Grab some fabric and cut the outer pocket, backing and binding strip pieces. Place the outer pocket and backing piece right sides together and pin along the side and bottom edges. And stitch. Clip the corners and trim the seam allowances and flip to the right side. Press using a point turner for those corners. Prepare the binding strip by pressing in half wrong sides together and then each long edge in towards the center fold. Sandwich the top of the pocket in between the binding strip and stitch. Sew close to the binding pressed edges. The pattern has a placement template to angle the patch pocket, but you can place it on your shacket wherever you like. Try on your shacket and play around with the placement, and when happy, simply top stitch in place, making sure the binding strip ends are pressed in and catched within the seam. Here is my finished shacket, and I just love how cozy and cute it is. Especially love all the details like the cuff, the contrasting snaps, that classic collar, as well as the cargo pocket. And speaking of pockets, I played around with additional placement of those patch pockets, but I decided to actually not stitch them on this particular shacket. I'm gonna save them for a future make because let's face it, I'm definitely gonna be making more of these. And on another version, I also want to play with this big sort of spotlight square on the back. I want to add like an embroidery design that would really pop. But I do love how like clean and classic this one is. And with some leftover fabric from my lining and backing, I made a little belt. So you can overlap those front edges and tie a little bow because it is long enough to create like a little peplum in a different silhouette, just a different way to wear this pattern. So thank you for watching this episode of the Quilted Runway. To get the pattern used in this video, click the link and you can download it for free for a limited time. And if you stitch one up, we want to see it. Use the hashtag the Quilted Runway on social so we can see all of your quilted shackets. And speaking of social, make sure to follow us on Instagram at SewDailyMakers and at Quilting Daily for more sewing and quilting fun and inspiration. And lastly, remember, anywhere can be your runway. Wear your quilted creations to a creative convention, a meetup, or just running errands. Happy stitching, and we'll see you next time. Bye!